Hi everyone, I'm Norfiza. My presentation today, Laughter, Gesture, and Sips of Coffee, is about looking at interactions through a transmodal lens based on a recording between me and my professor, Dr. Julie Choi. I'll begin by speaking briefly about the trans turn in applied linguistics before elaborating on transmodality and how it extends from multimodality. Next, I will share a case study of transmodality in action and illustrate how power was negotiated throughout the interaction. And finally, I'll conclude with some implications for both teachers and researchers. A central idea of the trans turn is about moving beyond named languages and recognizing languaging as a dynamic act. Languaging is also socioculturally shaped and thus subject to sociopolitical forces that result in inequalities between languages and language users. However, therein lies the beauty of the trans perspective, which holds the promise of transgressing and transcending these power relations. Of course, we can't talk about multimodality without mentioning Günter Kress. It's important to note that transmodality is not a dismissal or critique of multimodality per se, but a progressive push towards exploring how modes operate in a constantly evolving world. So Margaret Hawkins has taken up this concept, which she sees as an extension of how multimodality in keeping with the trans turn in applied linguistics. So one of Kress's most prominent ideas was how language is no longer the carrier of all meaning. If you look at this diagram, this is a common way of thinking about multimodality by identifying the individual modes and analyzing the meaning they each carry. Kress also defined modes as socially shaped and culturally given, and that meaning making is a result of human design. Transmodality, however, pushes this one step further and not only decenters language, but also human modes, highlighting how objects also have semiotic power and carry meaning. Rather than looking at individual modes, transmodality view modes as inseparable and influencing each other as they intermingle. It also accounts for space and time, and more importantly, the constant presence of power. Instead of human design, transmodality sees meaning making as a process of assemblage. For my case study of transmodality in action, I will be sharing screenshots from a recording I made with my professor, Dr. Julie Choi. She felt my paper on plurilingual practices could be useful for future students, so we decided to do a presentation of my paper in conversation with her. Already, this recording is transmodal in that it transcends space and time, but at the same time, the fact that it's recorded and that this recording took place in Julie's office on a subject that she's an expert in. As you can see, she's written a whole book about it. And also this was my first time co-presenting. All this created an incredibly high power asymmetry between us. Yet by the end of the recording, we both felt we had produced a rich and transformative co-construction of knowledge. What I hope you'll see in the next few slides then is how this negotiation of power took place through a complex entanglement of modes. Here you see a screenshot and a transcript of the opening minute of the recording. As you can imagine, I was very nervous and we both felt really awkward in this situation. So we just started laughing because that's what you do in nervous situations, right? But then right after that, Julie turns back to face the camera and realizes her proximity to the camera and adjusts herself. This is a moment of self-awareness where she realizes her dominant presence in the video. So she tries to create participation parity by moving away from the camera and angling herself towards me more. This is the first of many reconfigurations that attempted to create more collaborative relations of power. So after the introduction, Julie says, "I'll hand it over to you." But just because she's handed it over to me doesn't immediately make me feel like I'm the expert in this room. So one way my nervousness showed is this posture, me clasping my hands like I'm praying. However, on her part, Julie modulates the power by adopting this thinking posture, signaling to me that she's intellectually engaging with what I'm saying. And as I continued, Julie begins directing her gaze at me, giving me her full attention as I speak. Through these gestures and postures, she is positioning me as an expert and equal in this interaction through these embodied modes. But then here you see Julie's arms are crossed while I speak. Taken out of this context, some might see this as a negative thing, but having seen her in this pose before while teaching, I didn't see it negatively. I just read it as a professorial stance. You can see I'm still quite comfortable here, gesturing animatedly as I speak. Applying the transmodal perspective, we can see how a mode such as this posture carries specific meaning in this specific time and place and between these specific people. About 10 minutes into the presentation, I was becoming more comfortable and able to direct my gaze at Julie and the camera quite interchangeably. So you see Julie begins to slouch in her seat, this time embodying a relaxed person, signaling that it's okay, I'm not the presenter in this moment, I can just sit here and relax and listen. Perhaps the best example of what a synergic moment could look like, about 1.5 hours into the presentation, we were both talking at the same time and completing each other's sentences and making the same gestures. This couldn't have happened if I didn't feel comfortable speaking while Julie is speaking, which wouldn't have happened if we hadn't done all this negotiation of power through our bodies, our interactions with each other, as well as the objects in our space. Objects that might seem insignificant, like a pen and paper. You can see here that my hands are clasped again. This is because Julie has just asked me a question. And even though I've been speaking for an hour by now, I'm immediately nervous again. But as I answer, Julie starts writing notes. And this is again a way she positions me as an expert. She actively engages with what I'm saying. She writes notes as I speak. And this helps validate my expertise. Another object that featured prominently in our interaction is the coffee cup. As you can see, we each had one. What you're seeing here is another pattern. Each time Julie asks a question, she will drink her coffee. And this had two effects. First, it reinforced the casual atmosphere that this is just us chatting over coffee, but also it physically stops her from interjecting, and it becomes this signal of the floor is yours, and I'm just going to listen and I'm not going to interrupt or correct your response. However, note how even as she is constantly moderating this power, the moment Julie asks a question, I am praying all over again. So it's important to realize that this negotiation of power is not a one-time or linear process. No matter how comfortable I got, the minute she asked me a question, it still made me nervous. We really cannot underestimate just how deeply power is infused in every interaction. So while Julie was drinking her coffee throughout the presentation, for me, I only started holding the coffee cup 1 hour into the recording, but I did not drink from it. I held it, I spin it while she was speaking, but it is only 10 minutes before we finished that I finally take a long sip from my coffee. The same object in the same space carried vastly different meanings for us. These coffee cups not only played an integral role in the interaction, more importantly, it influenced how and what we were able to say and do. And finally, here we have another inanimate object, a blank wall. As we got more and more excited, Julie began illustrating a point she was making on this imaginary whiteboard, and I engaged with these invisible words on this invisible whiteboard. I look at it, I refer to it. The rich flow of ideas between us could not be limited by what was not in our space. So instead, we reimagined our space and allowed our ideas to transcend the words we were saying into this imaginary whiteboard that we both could see. So really what I've shown you is a story of how a nervous student and her professor came together and produced synergic collaborative knowledge. And here's a WhatsApp conversation we had immediately after the presentation. As you can see, we were both very much transformed by what we had experienced. This was not what we had anticipated when we thought about doing this. So how did we achieve this freaking amazing conversation that had so many dimensions, that was so rich and intense that it was mind-blowing, and an interaction that felt like a moment of true synergy? Well, It wasn't just through words, nor was it just about our proximity to each other or our body language and gestures. But the interaction was also very much shaped by the inanimate objects in our space, like the camera, which not only affected the direction of our gaze, but also influenced our proximity to each other. And you saw how significant the notebook and pen was. And the coffee cups, which had very different meanings for us, but so much meaning that it helped us shift the power dynamics between us. And of course, the wall, a blank wall that was transformed into a mode of communication. And let's not forget the space it was recorded in Julie's office, on university grounds, and also the spaces that future students who view this will be occupying, and how that will also influence the meanings they take away from it. Once you see how all these layers of modes intermingle and influence each other, you really see how human interactions embody all these trans ideas of fluidity, hybridity, synergy, and so on. At the end of the day, transmodalities references transcendence and transgression, where inequitable relations of power can be dismantled and reconfigured and afford equal representation to all participants in the transmodal interaction. So what does it all mean? Given how deeply embedded power is in every context and interaction, the value of transmodality is in how it enables us to not only observe complex entanglements of people, things, messages, but also why they matter, how it can help us transgress these inequalities. Seeing things transmodally also help us understand others and ourselves better. We become more self-aware of how our presence in any interaction and the objects and space we are in shapes the meanings that can be produced. We get a fuller picture of how humans communicate and begin to understand the people we are studying much more deeply. For educators, we need to recognize the high power asymmetry in our classrooms and the spatial and embodied modes that can help us shift this power. We need to see teaching as transmodal interaction, an interaction that is more complex than just words, to look beyond language and notice the rich ways our students are communicating, the various resources they negotiate with when meaning making. This is a way to highlight the multiplicity of perspectives and experiences among our students. If we open up this space for different ways of knowing, being, and doing, this could begin dismantling exclusionary teaching practices. This could be a way of doing what Freire once called teaching as an act of love. In the hyper-connected world we live in today, we increasingly encounter each other across greater distances and differences. How can we attempt to surmount this? If we are to teach, research, and speak differently, we need to start looking differently. And transmodality is one way you can do that. Thank you.